So, Craig, tell me, in your opinion, what motivates people to make a difference?
Well, firstly, it's great to join you, and thanks for the opportunity to have a chat about what I think are pretty important themes, always, but probably more particularly in Australia at the moment, when we're talking about cost of living and things become real for everyone, and that's part of the answer to your question, is many people kind of later in life, I think, have a different perspective, perhaps particularly those who feel as though they've done well in life. And you often find people then turn to trying to give back. And that's kind of a natural process of life. People go through, in the youth, trying to understand who and where we are, and then throughout whatever people's career is or something that they feel passionate about. And then we spend years, perhaps for many of us, building a family as well, but trying to achieve something in a field that you love. If we all have the gift of doing that, not everyone does, and then once we kind of get to a period in life where there's reflective time, or perhaps the children have grown up and people start to get a bit of time, then they look back and start to also look out.
Yeah.
So rather than just be focused on internal, today I've got to go to work, today I've got to do this, they start to then have time to sit down and talk with others and look out to the world more. And so that's a very kind of a predictable and normal process. I think other people, there's something in them, or perhaps in us, who even from a young age feel a sense of wrongdoing hits us in a different way, or people around us who aren't being treated fairly hits us, whether it's a conscience or whether it's a heart or whether it's just a little bit more of a sense of compassion or empathy, these words that we use so often. And those people tend to then, their passion actually is trying to create a better world for their children, for themselves and for others. And I've sort of in my life crossed between the two. From spending a lot of time trying to achieve in areas that I was passionate about. Sport is an obvious one. But at the same time, even in sport, trying to use it to help others and also helping people in sport. So, for example, when I was young, only 18, 19, 20, and I was a emerging footballer, soccer player in Australia, I already was advocating for the other players around me who I could see were being mistreated. So that's I think probably a long-winded answer to your question.
And probably a good point for us to pause and just welcome everyone to Community Matters, the podcast where we talk to people who are making a difference in our community. And to introduce you, Craig, with your very long and very impressive CV, which I have to read because...
Well, you can keep it as short as possible. Just do point form.
Point form. In point form, we're joined today by Craig Foster. Craig was a professional soccer player, you might know, football player, and captained the Socceroos, Australia's national team. Craig is a sports broadcaster and really was instrumental in raising the profile of soccer alongside Les Murray, I believe.
Les.
He's an author. He's a speaker. He has a Master's in Sports Administration, a Bachelor of Laws, and an Honorary Doctor of Laws from our very own University of Wollongong.
That's true.
Yeah. He's well known as a human rights ambassador for Amnesty International and for all of his human rights work, including rescuing or being instrumental in the rescue of a young Bahraini refugee from a Thai prison. Also, I was such a fan, helped Afghan women escape the Taliban in 2021, including the national women's soccer team. And led the Game Over campaign for Amnesty International. So proud of that, to remove hundreds of detainees from Australian offshore detention. Craig is a member of the Order of Australia for services to multiculturalism, sport and refugees. He is in the Australian Football Hall of Fame, and he served as chair of the Australian Players Association when he was advocating for the equality of women in the salaries.
And the like,
yeah, fantastic. And so today I think we're just going to have a chat about often as people we just look at the world and we just go, it's not fair. It's just not fair. Someone should do something about that. What was the point at which you went, someone should do something about that, and actually that someone's me?
So I guess, and you guys do great work. So, our community services are incredibly important. And what you're doing is you're living that and bringing to life what many of us believe is that everyone should have just basic opportunities and basic services, particularly in a country like Australia. And, there's so many barriers to that. Some of the barriers can be around multiculturalism and can be around discrimination against different groups, whether it could be on physical capability or it could be on mental capability or it can be on cultural differences and all of these things, can be on economic as well, so that, we still have far too much poverty in Australia, for example.
Yes.
And so for those of us who simply believe that we should all have basic opportunities in life and we shouldn't be discriminated against, and this sense of equality that Australia always talks about should be real, that means, we feel a sense of obligation to try and bring that to life. And if we're in fields where we see that actively, that can be really important. So in part answer to your question, people tend to they can better understand social justice issues when it touches them personally. It's a bit like illness, when people, they say that almost every family in Australia has been touched by some form of, cancer or some, and when that touches people personally, they understand it intimately, and all of a sudden you'll often find they then want to try and contribute, and next thing you know, they have a fundraiser and they're raising money for breast cancer, and because mum or daughter or grandmother has experienced it. And so that's important. That's one reason why in Australia I believe in a multicultural society that you always have to take every opportunity for integration. Because and First Nations, we saw that with the voice referendum, for example, the less that people know personally or are in touch personally with First Nations, the less likely they are to agree with or advocate for their rights. It's like really quite simple. And so proximity is important. And I've experienced that in my life because I played in the multicultural game, and I come out of Lismore, which was almost entirely people look like me, back in the 80s, in the 70s. And I left in the early 80s, and then I walked into the junior national football team, and all of a sudden here was all Croatian, Serbian, Turkish, Lebanese, Australians, who were my compatriots, who were my colleagues. And most of these cultural backgrounds I had never experienced. And, I might have just seen them on ABC News, and all of a sudden these became my friends, and all of a sudden we're playing sport together. And what that does is it just simply lowers all those barriers, because it's like your cultural differences are of zero value when it's just about kicking the ball into the other net, right? And therefore we have to, even if language is a problem, we have to find ways to communicate in order to achieve our sporting objective. And I look at Australia in a very similar way, where we have to, if we codify what are our objectives, and we're talking here about the objectives, everyone just being able to have a good life, then if that's the objective, then, how is it that we bring those to life? So when we see disadvantage around us, we're much more attuned to be able to understand the difference, and then it's natural to ask the question, well, how did that occur? What is the problems that occur here, like First Nations, for example? And then we can start to dig into, well, how can we, change those? So, that is, I think, the important work that you're doing in the community is you are trying to lift everyone up to at least provide opportunities for them, as I do with refugees and a whole heap of, other fields of Australian life. It's really quite straightforward. It's like we should be able to see every other person as surely of intrinsic equal value to us. Like if we can't do that, then we've been taught. We often see the little videos which are powerful of little children, and they're in kindergarten, and the kids just see each other as a child.
Yes.
Right, and those videos, they go viral on social media because people love them because it's so pure. And then at some point from there, we get to adulthood when people want to put all the barriers up and see people as less worthy. And I always think that we just need to go back to that. We should see everyone as worthy. That's natural in human life. And if that's the case, let's just try and make it happen.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it was really interesting because you used the word social justice, and Community Industry Group is absolutely founded on the principles of social justice 30 odd years ago, and we continue it today. We really believe in it, and we believe in those principles like equity, and that people should have whatever they need to lead a decent life, whatever a decent life looks like to that and to them, and it shouldn't all. We don't all have the same opinion of what a decent life looks
That's
like,
true.
but those are the principles we're founded on and the things we believe in. But it's a principle that's not really understood by lots of other people. And somebody said to me recently, "Oh, social justice is a bit scary and it needs a rebrand." But when I talk to you about social justice, you make it very clear. What does social justice mean when you talk about it? What do you think it looks like?
Well, social justice just means that everyone in my view, everyone in society is treated the same and has the same opportunities. What you do with those opportunities is a matter for you. And everyone has different passion. For some people, money is a passion. For others, it's not. For some people, helping others is a great passion, or trying to explore their sporting limits is a great passion. Whatever it is that you want to pursue, you should have the opportunity to do so, and that means that you're not in poverty, that you have a basic education, that your income level of your family shouldn't be an inhibitant to you being able to do something in your life. It means that if you have different abilities to others or disabilities, then society provides you with an opportunity and the tools and the environment to still be able to achieve what it is that you want to achieve. These are all very basic things. Justice, so that's what I guess you would call social equality. What justice means is that there are groups in society who haven't been treated that way, and therefore there's organisations like yours and people like me who say, well, we want to turn that around. We think that's the way that this group is being treated is wrong, and therefore we want to fix it. It's really that simple. Now, in fixing it, it means that we have to understand what the problem has been, how they've been treated, why they've been treated that way, and change the system of rules, of policies, of cultural understanding or misunderstanding, so that in future they can be better treated. But in so doing, it means that you have to understand what they've experienced and what they've come through. And by understanding what they've come through, we're able to then change policy, but also say, well, actually, we want to make it up to this group. Okay, because they're in severe poverty because they've been treated this way, and therefore we need equity means that we need to do something for them. Because it's not enough, we think, and I think, most humans would agree, it's not enough just to say, oh, well, okay, we got all this stuff wrong here, and this group is really in severe disadvantage, and therefore, but we now recognise it, so let's just make some policy today, and don't worry about all these people who can't get out of it, but the next generation's going to be totally cool. That's not justice, okay? That's a policy change. Justice means, okay, we really messed up with this group here. We now get it. We're going to change the policy so the next generation's totally cool, but what can we do for you guys to make sure that tomorrow it's going to be much better and you're going to be back on an equal footing? That's called justice. Super simple, And what you find in life is that any of us, everyone, this is a fact, everyone in Australian society who feels they've been hard done by will expect what for themselves? They will expect justice.
Yeah.
Everyone. Every single person. It's like it is a fact of human nature. So if someone in your local community, in your local street, something's gone wrong and something's messed up with their house or something, I guarantee you they'll be up to the council. They'll be calling for this, and they'll call for what? Compensation, it's called. Happens every day, on every street, in every part of Australia. But then when we say, well, this disadvantaged group here needs justice and compensation and needs to go to the council is the Australian government, the same stuff. What happens on your street is only what we're talking about. But it has been, I think, to your point, recently it's been demonised a lot because, because power in human nature does not like to relinquish in any fashion. That's the reality. And so when you talk about trying to adjust the settings of society to give disadvantaged groups equal or even give them some rights to lift them up, that is, in most cases, a challenge. It's always a challenge to someone, and it's very often a challenge to power structures.
Yep.
Power structures don't like change, and therefore what's changed today is many of those power structures are using social media and using all sorts of mis and disinformation and all sorts of campaigns to undermine the very concept of justice, and that's what we need to fight back against.
I think that's right. I think one of the big barriers that we face in the community services industry, right across the board, from aged care, disability, homelessness, women's services, is that in order to bring justice, in order to bring equality or equity to groups of people, it's expensive. We need government to invest in the community services sector, and it's not sexy in the budget. And I think that is a big barrier to supporting people to be able to live the good lives that they deserve.
Yeah, that's a great point. The point I'll make is this, that's here and that's now. So, in human life and in society and in government systems, nothing is concrete. Like this, if that might be, that might well be the way Australia feels now, but not every country feels that way. So that's not an objective statement. What you're saying is you're indicating a kind of political shadow or state of play in Australia at the moment, whether it's right or wrong. I always like to go back to first principles, basically, and say, okay, I don't really care if this government or that government or Australian media has convinced everyone that this is the case. Like, what is the right thing for us to do? And often you find yourself swimming against what is the current tide. But what? People were swimming against the tide of women's rights to vote, over 100 years ago. I mean, the most basic things people take for granted today, people had to fight for. Yeah. And so I just think that change very rarely comes easily. And there's always people in societies all around the world that has to actually advocate for that change. It's just the way it is. And because society tends to, in order for it to, continue, in order for the Albanese government to be elected with a majority of Australians have to feel that they don't want too much to change. So in other words, it's working for a large group of people. And therefore, if you're working, trying to lift up people at the margins, you're always going to be pushing against the masses. It doesn't matter, what you're talking about. And so, I just think we have to recognise in the fields that we're in that is just the state of play. That's the reality of human organisation of societies. And therefore, you have to just, take that as read, realise that you are always pushing against the current and just further develop your skills, In other words, what I'm saying is it's no good pulling your hair out because, that's the way it is. It's always been that way. And I think it will always be that way. And that's why it's important. Like people often say to me, well, how do you deal with all the pushback and, the vitriol and all of this stuff when you talk about whatever, refugees or women's rights or Matildas or this? I say, well, what do you expect? Like the thing is, you're trying to push society forward. Of course, there has to be an automatic reaction. Because people, people are challenged by change, particularly if they feel that it's going to impact on them. And therefore, you have to expect the reaction and you speak for the reaction. You actually often want to trigger the reaction in order to trigger the conversation.
Yes, and I guess that just means that we'll be still working. Me and my team will still be working. We're still.
Well, that was supposed to be positive.
No. We feel. I think all of our team and all of our sector, we feel really strongly about the things that we advocate for, and I think that just means that we have to keep doing it. You touched briefly on First Nations people and. You talked about the voice, and we've just seen it weaponised again, both the voice and Welcome to Country during the last election campaign. And you talked earlier about we have to understand what people have come through. Do you think we understand enough yet of what our First Nations people come through? And I will just point out, we are coming to you today from the beautiful lands of the Dharawal people. It's a beautiful place, and we are very connected to our wonderful Aboriginal colleagues. But I think a lot of society don't really think about what First Nations people have been through.
So our generation see some progress, and we also see the veil that's been pulled over our history perhaps better than anyone, because I'm in my mid-50s and I went through school, and now I've seen the voice, and I've seen land title and land rights and so on and da. So we've lived through a whole lot of these issues, and what we're able to do is to reflect on the fact that we were told about none of them.
No, that's right.
So therefore, our education, we didn't even know. No. So our education was, well, let's all go one day a year, dress up as Aboriginal people, paint ourselves black, and do a corroboree. And that was the only interest that our education department had in First Nations. So we had no education as what happened. There was no talk about invasion. There was no talk about terra nullius. There was no things that we all learned in law. So, that answers your question. The point is Australia still doesn't understand because we're still discovering. And the reason we're still discovering is because of power systems, obviously, And so when you're in social justice, I think you have to start to understand power much better. And power is based on, current paradigms, current thinking, and changes to those thinking is always some form of a threat. And so really Australia's starting to just factually analyse what happened post-1788 is very challenging to a lot of very powerful Australians. That's just a simple fact. And of course, many of those Australians are in politics, and many of those Australians are big funders to politics, and many of those have significant influence on state and territory governments and on federal governments. This is just the way it works. So when and I've been in kind of Indigenous rights advocacy since my early 20s in a number of ways, 30 years, you see how hard it is for them has been to advocate. It's just been unbelievable, because you're talking about trying to challenge an entire way of thinking. And this is what we call the culture wars.
Yes.
Yeah. So in order to try and not breach this very strongly built idea of what Australia is or was as part of because your history is who you are today. Australia, sections of Australia want to hold on to that idea of how, colonisation started, if you like, because to unsettle that with any truth or facts is, challenges the entire narrative. Whereas for people like me, I see it differently. I see it as just being the truth, and I just don't think it challenges anything. In fact, I think it enriches the country. Like when we say, when we talk about now, Newcastle University has discovered that there's at least 460 massacres, and they had to, after 3 or 4 or 5 years, they stopped their research because they said we just don't have any more time. But we could go on. That's 460 massacres, the vast majority of which Australia was not only didn't know about, but wasn't interested in finding out about. That's the key point. Now, the fact that we found out about them, has that changed the entire nature of the country? I don't think so. I just think it means that we better understand where we came from. And I think any country is stronger for understanding its true self and its true origins. And I don't feel challenged by that, as an Australian, whether white Australian or otherwise. But what it does do is it allows us to then say, oh, geez, well, okay, hang on a minute. Our First Nations, many of those nations who still exist today, holy hell, like that's what you guys went through. We didn't know that. And now in knowing, we can say, oh, far out. Well, that's some of the reasons why you guys are here. Let's dig into that. Like what actually happened and what, like the stolen generation, for example.
Yes.
Well, my grandparents or my parents were not stolen. Okay. And so the fact that one group of people in Australia had their parents stolen, surely that's something that we need to understand, think about what the impacts of that have been, and then work into what those impacts are today and try and solve it with them. Like it's really that simple. But if you don't want your idea of Australia disturbed, you don't want facts to be known about, the colonisation and treatment and mistreatment of First Nations people. It's really that simple. I think it's going to happen because the next generation doesn't care as much because they're growing up with this education, which is why, of course, you have the education wars.
I think it's such a great point. We can't move forward as a nation together unless we understand where we came from, and I think that the more we understand about what happened post-colonisation, the better we'll grow together as a nation. Yeah. Yeah,
and can I just add this? I'll go back to what I said before. One of the issues with social justice, and we're talking about First Nations rights here, is just the hypocrisy of people who don't want to deal with it. So I can guarantee you, and this is what gets me, I can guarantee you that every person who says, well, we don't need to know about it or, attacks it or whatever, I guarantee you if it was their parents stolen,
yeah,
right, I guarantee you they'd be screaming for justice, right? And I can say that with 100% confidence. Because that's the way people are. That's the way we all are. If it was my parents, I'd be screaming.
Yeah.
I'd be screaming blue murder.
Yeah.
If my children had 100 times greater likelihood of being detained by police, not even put into jail, but just actually picked up, then just simply the fact that they're Indigenous and they're walking along with a bike. This is just a fact of Australian society. Okay, my son or daughter is walking along just trailing a bike in Sydney where I live, or an Indigenous person is trailing a bike. That Indigenous child is, I don't know the figure, but I would imagine at least 10 or 20 times more likely to be stopped by police because they're trailing a bike to ask whether it's their bike than my child. In fact, my child likely, as I did, would go through life with that never happening. So when I was studying my law degree, at the early stages, it took me a few goes, but when I was in my 20s, I was reading about some of these cases in Queensland, and they really struck me because what happened was these kids kept coming into court, and a judge ended up saying, and they were being constantly questioned about whether you own this or you own this and you own this. And then one of the kids said to the policeman after about the umpteenth time of being stopped, said, look, F you, this, that, and the other, which is what I would have done.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's what 99% of people would have done. But they don't reflect on how they would act in the situation if your parents were done or if your children were constantly picked up. How would you respond to that? And then what happened is they went in and finally the law changed because a judge, and what they would do is the policeman would then say, oh, well, you're on like, whatever you call, awful language policy,
Yeah.
law, right? So they would actually incarcerate them because they swore at a police officer. And eventually what a judge said was, he said, look, Mr. Police Officer, I've given this a little bit of thought, but I was coming in this morning with my children in my car. I was taking them to school. And he said, on the radio, I heard the exact same terms that you're now saying this young Indigenous person said to you, and that you're so offended. But the people on the radio this morning are saying F and blinding, blah, 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 blah. And he said, this has become so accepted in society, I'm no longer prepared to incarcerate these young children simply because they use those terms. But it took a judge to work against the system, you see.
Yeah.
The system was working against those children. And, without spending, we could talk about that for hours, about systemic racism and systemic injustice, how a system does that. But ultimately, the point I'd like to make is that I can guarantee you this, that if that happened to my child, I would respond the same way. If it happened to you or your child, you would respond the same way. And if it happened to anyone in society, I don't care what your politics is, you would do exactly the same thing. So you must extend the same rights to those other people in society, okay? Because they're being treated differently. And that's what we call empathy. And we know that it's at short supply because Scott Morrison had to go to empathy training, for God's sake. I mean, if you got to go to empathy training, you know that, we're not talking about it much, or all it means is, all I would ask all Australians to ask themselves when they see something happen is just say, if that happened to me, what would I do? And I guarantee you that you would want justice.
I think that's a fantastic point. To move on to our last question, and it's a question that we pose to everybody who comes on this podcast. It's called Community Matters. Who in the community matters to you?
Well, I mean, I would say everyone, but the actual concept of community matters to me. So what happened was I come out of a very strong community anyway, which was the area of Lismore and Far North Coast, and sport was a big factor there, and people would contribute to the community a great deal, right? And you see that breaking down in recent decades. But people would give to their sporting club, they would give to other clubs, they would give their services, give their time. I often talk about when I was young, our soccer club, our football club, they would have what were called working bees.
Yeah.
And you talk to the young generation today, and they go, what the hell are you talking about? And so people used to go, and I used to hate it because I had to turn up and, dig, and I just wanted to play for football. I was like, why am I building this club, bro? But my father would be there saying to his three sons, no, you need to be there, right? And you're not leaving until we finish this field. And so we had to, use, cut the grass and put fences in and concrete, or at least help. I'd obviously carry the stuff. I didn't know what I was doing. But, and so, that's what people did for the community. So that's kind of where I grew up. And then what happened was during COVID, I started to help some of the bigger charities who I already knew, the big kind of food distribution charities and so on. And they were getting big sums from the government, and they were wanting to tell their story and stuff. Anyway, I went into an organisation that I already knew, and it was called Addison Road, is up in Marrickville. And what I found was that in times of extreme distress on people's lives, what they were actually doing was seeking community in their local area.
Yeah.
Because that's where the social trust is. And so people were actually, once they knew that we were open to give out food, everyone just descended. And it wasn't just for food, it was for connection. They knew people there. They knew people in the street about, next door, and then over in the next suburb. They'd seen each other in the shops, and they just wanted to be in the presence of other humans, because we are a communal species, we always have been. And so what happened was people came, and instead of just giving food, the organisation then said, oh, well, geez, you guys need lawyers because your students are going to be turfed out. So lawyers came, and then people had no money. They were out of hospitality jobs. So hairdressers came and gave free haircuts, and people needed advice on visas. And so all of a sudden what happened is we wrapped around all these services around people. And what I saw was like what I would say is real life, is just people in a local area contributing, giving, giving like I've got too much of this, they would just bring it and go, here, take some rice, or takes it out. And community gardens were started, and people and that was very, very powerful. And that I saw then a kind of vision of what I really actually think life should be. We need a global outlook, but we also need a local existence, right? And Australia has a big place in the world, and we like to diminish it. I think every country has a very significant responsibility to be a responsible actor, right? And everything we do here impacts people everywhere.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we live our lives in proximity to others, and it's the way we treat them. So if each community does a great job, you end up as a great country, right? Otherwise, this top-down approach, takes a long, long time. If Wollongong respects all your people, looks after them, makes sure everyone has what they need, and can come and get things, that they don't have, and then that expands. And goodness expands quickly. So I think, to answer your question, I think community is absolutely key. And I do think that human life is going to return a lot more to local community because of climate issues and a whole range of other factors. I think that people are going to start to just focus on the area around them, make it fully sustainable. And you have too much of this, and let's just, you give a bit of that, I'll give a bit of this, and we'll give a bit of this, and perhaps move away from this idea that the more we have, the better we are, or the bigger person we are, just because I can have 5 cars and the biggest house ever, anywhere. I hope that that's going to peter out a bit.
I think that, many of our members would practice just place-based community development, and that's exactly what you're talking about. It's such a beautiful thing.
I should have used that term.
No. Well, thank you so much, Craig, for being with us. I think we've all there's so much there for us to take out and to ponder. I would just like to thank Craig for being here. I would like to thank you all for listening and watching. I'd encourage you all to like and share, and perhaps give us a review. And stay tuned next time for Community Matters, the podcast where we discuss community issues with the people making a difference.